Hello and don't go away. I have an answer to the question you probably asked yourself over the last year. What exactly is a metrosexual superpower? You might say, a metrosexual superpower? I've never heard that term before. Well, where have you been? In 2004, the futurologist, whatever that is, Parakana, published an article in the well-renowned journal Foreign Policy, where he claimed that the future of diplomacy is the way of the European Union. The time of power projection, military force, all of this great power politics, all of it is gone. The future is the metrosexual superpower, which was the actual title. If you ever have a spare minute, you can Google it. I also posted it on my social media accounts. And the idea was that the sophisticated, the well-versed, the cultural Europeans, they will move past, again, a direct quote, the bumbling Americans and all these other powers in the world, because they lack the refinement of the Europeans. And our soccer teams and our culture, our theaters, our movies, all of this, it will seduce the world into becoming more and more like the European Union. So the future, supposedly in 2004, according to this futurologist, who is still writing for several outlets, so for whatever reason, his future was quite bright, even though that of his predictions wasn't, is that the world will turn into a conglomerate of the European Union, American unions, African unions, Asian unions. So they will all emulate, they will all turn towards the European Union as their role model. Well, that was in 2004. Now, in 2026, it seems that we have not moved into a new future, but into somewhat resembling an old past. I would call the year 2026 the year of neo-imperialism. Now, I'm not the first one to use this term. I've talked about neo-mercantilism in the past with my good friend Mike Lavery, with whom we did a couple of podcasts on Brussels Signal and have already another one in the pipeline. But it's not just a new era in trade policies, it's also a new era in foreign policy. And I think that neo-imperialism is a nice way to describe it. Now, as I say here, Europe continues to stumble through political dysfunction, but global power is reshaped by seismic shift. The Western Hemisphere is witnessing the return of kind of unabashed, naked American imperialism, which many of us call the so-called Don Roe doctrine. And I also think that it's not just the United States, but all the great powers are slowly but surely redrawing the world, and what they're creating are new spheres of influences. So what is going to happen in 2026 may well be, in fact it already is, the end of the so-called liberal international order, which was never truly liberal. It was somewhat international and it was somewhat of an order. But these days are beyond us. The first shot, if you want, or the first in kind of more than just a metaphorical sense, was the striking back of the American empire in Venezuela. Now, whatever you think about the actions taken by the Trump administration regarding Venezuela's president, or supposed president, depending on whom you ask, Nicolas Maduro, it's become very clear that they are not just talking the imperial talk, they are walking the imperial walk. For too long, in the eyes of the current administration, but I think they're not wrong about this, the United States have tolerated Iran, China, Hezbollah, and all other kinds of unsavory actors, the drug cartels, to operate almost unhindered in their own backyard. This is about to come to an end. And what I found both frustrating, if you believe in international law, but also encouraging, if you believe in clear talk, about this action is there wasn't even an attempt made by the Trump administration to claim that this was done in the name of human rights, that this was done in the name of promoting democracy, in the name of nation building. No, this was a clear sign and clearly executed as making sure that whoever runs Venezuela has to run it aligned with US interests, but they do not care who's actually running it. I mean, just to give a concrete example, there is no new regime in Venezuela. The person in charge has been the deputy of Nicolas Maduro. There has been no change in the military. There is even, at least at the moment, reporting that they're actively looking and hunting for people who collaborated with the United States. So this probably could turn out like another Afghanistan scenario, where the very people who supported the US are the very ones that will be punished for it. But what Trump has made absolutely clear in this administration is that they say, listen, at the end of the day, we don't care who runs Venezuela as long as you run it in a way that we profit from it. And by profit, I mean economically, strategically, geographically, in all dimensions of geopolitics and geoeconomics that you can imagine. And I think this is their bet. They say, if those who are now in power in Venezuela are smart enough, they will understand that it's better to be alive and a vassal of the United States than to oppose the United States and be either dead or in prison. It's going to be an interesting bet. Let's see if it pans out. At the same time, I think it is important to say that this American strategy is not something new. It is a revival of the Monroe strategy from the early 19th century, something that was also reasserted not just by Monroe, who created it, but also by Theodore Roosevelt and now also by Donald Trump. And they made this very, very clear in the National Security Strategy that was published in December last year. As I always say, whether you think this is good or whether you think this is bad is open for argument. But it's very difficult to deny that it is obvious. And in a certain sense, the world is returning to an order as it has always been. That great powers will make sure that they create spheres of influence from which they can extract resources, geographical advantages, and in the best case, from the perspective of the respective great power, escalation dominance with the competitors. And I think the United States have realized that vis-a-vis China, contrary to what many analysts claim, they don't really have escalation dominance. If China can cut off your rare earth supply, if they can cut off many of the key ingredients for your pharmaceutical industry, you don't really hold all the cards in the conflict. Now, this does not mean that the United States themselves could not hurt China. And a lot of the policies that we are seeing at the moment are aimed at gaining control over those who provide China, particularly with crude oil. Now, at the same time, something also talked about in another podcast, China is trying to become independent or as independent as possible from crude oil imports. This is why, for example, they have made huge investments in turning coal into fuels, like the famous Fischer-Tropsch process. We know that the United States are considering recognizing regimes in South Yemen and Somaliland. Now, you might wonder, why would all of a sudden the United States be so interested in South Yemen and Somaliland? Well, the reason for this is very clear. If you have friendly regimes there, you have an outsized influence on the Red Sea. Now, why is it? And of course, the Straits. Now, you might also wonder, why is there this new interest in Greenland? Well, due to global warming, yes, I did say it, but the Northwestern Passage, trade through the Arctic, all of things that have been, let's say, less possible in the past are becoming quite possible now. So the strategic importance of Greenland is increasing. And the Trump administration, from a pure geostrategic American perspective, sees it within their interest to control all these choke points, both outside, but of course even more so within the Western Hemisphere. So from the Suez Canal to the Northwest Passage to the policies in the Arctic, all of this is on the Trump administration's radar. Now, I think the question for Europe is whether or not the Europeans want to be antagonists or partners in this endeavor. There is a school of thought that, not entirely wrongly, I would say, suggests that the Europeans are vassals of the United States. And to a certain extent, this is true. The independent decision-making or the strategic autonomy of Europe is basically non-existent. However, we have to be honest enough and admit that this dependence on the United States did come with certain advantages. We did spend significantly less on defense than the United States did. We relied on the United States for security reasons, starting with the wars in the Balkans, the Arab Spring, the situation in Ukraine, and so on and so on. And you might say that, of course, all of these conflicts were also instigated by the United States. But at the same time, you can say, particularly when you look at the Arab Spring, European powers were just as happy with these developments, at least at the beginning, than the United States have been. You could even make the case that the Europeans, when it actually fit their interests, had no problem with going against the wishes of the United States. I give you a concrete example. The entire pipeline network that connects Europe, particularly Western Europe and Russia, was built during the Cold War against the resistance of the United States. But the Europeans needed energy. Pipeline energy was cheaper than the alternatives, so they didn't care what Ronald Reagan at the time had to say. Nord Stream 2, whoever blew it ultimately up, whether it was done by the Americans, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Ukrainians and the Americans together, whether the Germans knew, whether the Germans did not know. The truth, I guess, is somewhere in the middle, but the point remains the same. Nord Stream 2 was built, also Nord Stream 1, against the resistance of the United States. So the idea that the Europeans wanted to be independent, but they were forced to dance to the tune of the Americans, is partially true, but not entirely. When it fit their interests, the Europeans were absolutely capable of doing their own thing. But at the same time, of course, they always relied on the American security umbrella, which more or less came for free. Now, this is something that appears to come to an end. That the United States are now saying, listen, you want military protection, or you want us to still carry the heaviest burden within the NATO alliance, then we need to get something from you as well. And historically, it often is forgotten, the United States always attracted a high price from its allies. The British Empire, which declined and ultimately dissolved after World War II, was not so much destroyed by Germany. It was much more destroyed by the high price that Franklin Delano Roosevelt extracted from the British Empire for his support of the UK during World War II. It is very often forgotten, but during the conference in Yalta, close to the end of the war, Roosevelt even suggested to Stalin, Sean McMeekin, who was a guest, a historian on our show last year, kind of describes this great scene where Roosevelt was suggesting to Stalin that there should be a Bolshevik-like revolution in India. And he also said to Stalin not to talk to Churchill about this because he's a little bit sensitive about India. And it was Stalin, of all people in the world, who said, the idea of a Bolshevik revolution in India, it sounds interesting, but due to the caste system and the conditions on the ground, it might not be the most ideal candidate. So you had this absurd situation where Roosevelt was pushing for a Soviet-style revolution in India, which at that time was an integral, if not the integral part of the British Empire, and it was Stalin who refused. But they demanded British gold, bases in the Indian Ocean, the entire Caribbean, or almost the entire Caribbean possessions of the British Empire. So even though Winston Churchill said that he did not become Her Majesty's First Minister to preside over the end of the British Empire, at the end of the day he did. Now, to be very clear, I'm not one of those who now put all the blame at the feet of Churchill and say that he was a terrible prime minister. I don't think that's the case at all. I think there's a lot of gratitude. And I think when it comes to standing on the right side of history, I think the British did stand on the right side of history. But we should not close our eyes to the fact that the United States made them pay a very, very high price. So when the United States now demand the possession of Greenland, like not just the allowance to have military bases there, but to actually own it, in exchange for the United States to remain in NATO, maybe keep up whatever form, intelligence sharing and other forms of support for Ukraine, that is not a historical anomaly. I would say that fits very, very well into the broader historical pattern of the United States foreign policy. Now, another theory I would like to suggest is what I call the grand bargain theory, which is that the United States, or at least parts of the Trump administration, are willing, or if not desire, to make a deal both with the Chinese and the Russians. And the argument is the United States can no longer remain a weak global empire, but we can become a strong regional empire. And that region would be the Western Hemisphere. That this is the area that the United States will dominate. China and Russia recede, retract from Latin America, but at the same time, the United States will slowly and gradually reduce their support for Taiwan and, in a similar fashion, reduce their support for Ukraine to a point where Russia will make significant territorial gains. Now, as always, acknowledging something is not the same as approving it. I'm not saying that I'm happy with this outcome. I'm not saying that it's the best possible outcome. I just think it appears to be the outcome that is emerging. Now, as a European, and as most of our viewers are, but even as an American, it might sound cruel to allow entire parts of the world to fall under Russian or Chinese control. But of course, the question is, what are the alternatives? If the alternative would be war, maybe even a world war, probably, and I know I'm sounding very cynical here and I'm asking for your forgiveness, but I think, unfortunately, realism and cynicism are very often twins. And it is also the case here, that a world divided into competing spheres of interest, but into somewhat stable spheres of interest that respect each other's territorial interests, that respect each other's sovereignty, even though, which I'm terrified to say, they do things domestically that we disapprove of, that we disagree with, might be a better recipe to prevent war than all the alternatives. Now, and to be quite clear, we accept and respect lots of domestic abuses when it is in our geopolitical interest. There is not a lot of appetite for supporting human rights in the democratic, by name, Republic of Congo, because we get a lot of cobalt from there. We do accept human rights abuses, and we have accepted them in China for a very, very long time because the market was very important for us. We did accept Russian violations of human rights pretty much since the late 90s and early 2000s when Vladimir Putin came to power, because we wanted trade relations with them. The same is true in Latin America. The same is true in the Middle East, if you look at countries like Saudi Arabia. So none of this is particularly new. And as I said, as much as I would wish for a world where everybody believes in the same values and adheres to the same ideals, I think this is unrealistic. And it's tragic, but I think global politics as such have a tendency towards the tragic. Now, the question is whether in Europe, if we can no longer ensure or aspire to make the entire world look more like Europe, so if our metrosexual appeal apparently is not as strong as we thought it would be, that we see what should be our priorities in the first place. And I think a major problem is that all the things that I just say about human rights abuses, problems with democracy, well, this seems to accumulate within Europe as well. Even the current Pope recently made an announcement that he's very worried about freedom of speech in the West and in Europe in particular. And I think that is true. There's a tendency by the European Union, as it can no longer fulfill or live up to its claims of universal applicability, like this idea that the European Union is the role model for the world, that they are turning inwards and that they're increasingly turning against their own people. We saw kind of the foreign policy impotence when, after the US operations in Venezuela, European leaders were tweeting their concerns, that they were worried, they were monitoring the situation, but they were unable to do anything about it. There is no capacity among the European powers to truly project power abroad. Maybe a little bit, this was the French in Africa and North Africa, but even French power has been significantly diminished over the last couple of years. Yet the impotence abroad is beginning to be replaced or compensated for with omnipotence domestically. There are endless schemes where all of the European nations are supposed to align with an ideology coming out of Brussels, and everybody who even slightly wanders off the reservation, like the Hungarians, is supposed to be punished, excluded from the Erasmus program, sanctions, public shaming, blackmailing, the holding back of funds, and so on and so on and so on. Then, of course, the entire net zero madness is still going on. This absurd idea that you can have an arms industry without energy, which is absurd on its face, but it's kind of these last ideological vestiges that the EU is clinging to. The internal culture wars that are becoming increasingly more violent. I mean, just read the reports out of New Year's Eve in Amsterdam, in Berlin, and other European cities. And this destructive self-transformation that is taking place. So the question then is, in this potential conflict between Europe and the United States, or Europe and China, is that instead of constantly looking abroad and how we can educate or enlighten others, maybe we should take a closer look at ourselves. Whether or not Trump is going to get Greenland, I think is less important than the question, what is happening or what territory are we losing closer to home? If Vienna, London, Paris, Copenhagen are semi-Islamite cities, if they're increasingly becoming semi-Islamized countries, is it really important who owns Greenland? I'd rather maintain European nations as European nations than whoever stations a couple of boots on the ground in Greenland. And if it's all because of the resources we hear so much about, then I have to ask, why didn't Europeans mine those resources in the first place? And this goes back to what I mentioned, this net zero madness and virtue signaling. So we say, oh, Trump is just after the resources. You know what? Good for him. At least he might be willing to mine those resources. Whereas the Europeans, as is their wont, would rather have all resources all around the planet remain in the ground. That's a nice recipe if you want to return to the Stone Age. But who wants that? I mean, sure, so we have a Stone Age adjacent energy policy, and we increasingly import people whose ideology appears to be from the Stone Age. And I think this is a very, very unsustainable model, a very, very unsustainable process. So I would again argue that let's focus on ourselves. Let's accept the fact that in this great power competition, the European role will be a small one, but I think that is just fair. It is important now to focus on the things that go on internally and domestically. The fundament for every empire, for every great power, is laid domestically in its internal politics. The idea that you can be internally weak but very powerful abroad, that might function for a very short amount of time, but ultimately this is a recipe for failure. We need to get control back over our political fate, we need to get control back over our demographic development, and we need to control back over the civilizational erasure, as the US administration mentioned in the national security strategy in December, that needs to stop. I used to say, as my friends over at Doomberg say as well, that Donald Trump is everything his critics and his followers say he is. And whenever he talks about Greenland, I get a little bit of a cringy feeling. I roll my eyes. But then I read again the national security strategy, where we see the first US administration who is truly worried about the civilizational and cultural decline of Europe, and they want to do something about it. So if the price they demand from the Europeans, or from Europe, whoever is going to be in charge of Europe in the years to come, if they say, we support those movements, those political parties, those media outlets that want to ensure that Europe stays European, and if the price for that is Greenland, I want to be completely honest here, I think that is a price worth paying. I'd rather have a Trump who is pro-European civilization, who gets Greenland, than have whoever is going to be his successor who might leave Greenland alone, but is not pro-European civilization, who is not against mass immigration, who is not certain about the fact that it is in America's interest to have a civilizationally confident Europe and maybe even a civilizationally confident European Union. The dream, as I started today's show, of the metrosexual superpower, where everything is defined by appearances, by weakness masquerading as strength, these days are over. And there might be something good in it, because the wake-up call was supposed to come. But the question now is, will the Europeans just hit the snooze button, roll over, and continue to dream their delusionary dreams? Or is it finally time to wake up and face reality? We will see, but 2026 has barely started, and it's already a year like no other. Thank you very much.